This is the study session on equity investments and the reading on Introduction to Industry and Company Analysis. A reading that might be overlooked, but I think it's an important one. To give you a sense of what is the important concepts inside of this reading, what I want you to do is consider a financial analyst and his or her client. Let's suppose that a client comes to the analyst and says something like, hey, I've got a bunch of money here, and I think I need about a 10% required return. And it's your job as the financial analyst to decide where to invest those funds to be able to generate that 10% return. Well, this is what you do. You start by analyzing the macroeconomy, and you look at key variables that we discussed back in the economics study session. Things like interest rates and inflation and government influence and oil prices and the threat of war, all those macroeconomic variables. So then what you do inside of a country, you say, okay, I think the economy is going to grow by, let's pick a number, say 3%. Then what you do is you find the pockets inside of that economy that are going to grow by more than the average. Because remember, that economic growth rate is an average of all the industries in there. So then what you do is you try to find those specific industries that are going to grow by something greater than 3%. Clearly, you don't want to be a part of an industry that grows by 1% or even constricts in size. So you pick, let's say, 10 different industries, and then you want to find the best stocks within each of those industries to deliver for the client. I mean, this is classic top-down analysis. And that's what this chapter is about. But the focus here, of course, is on industry analysis. There's some broad macroeconomic analyses littered throughout it. And then at the very end, there's a couple of suggestions on company analysis. So let's get right to the LOSs. First one asks us to explain the use of industry analysis and the relation of industry analysis to company analysis. And that's what we're going to do probably throughout all this slide deck. All right, so a few things here to think about industry analysis. Why is it important? What it does is it helps us understand the company's business and the business environment. And that's really important. The business environment. I have a colleague who has a PhD in management and also has lots of professional experience in supply chain. And he talks regularly about scanning the environment, doing an end scan. And he's clearly onto something. And this is what we're doing in industry analysis. We're scanning the environment for the competition, for the risks, and potential growth opportunities. Now, as good active financial analysts, we can use industry analysis to see whether or not we want to overweight or underweight particular industries or sectors as they compare to those benchmark weights. And then finally, we can do some portfolio attribution analysis in which we can decide whether or not the portfolio manager's performance was based on asset selection or asset allocation. Three major approaches to industry classification. What we can do is we can group companies according to the products and the services in which they deliver. I mean, the classic example, of course, is the automobile industry. That's going to be, you got these different companies that make some little cars, they make some middle cars, they make some big cars, they make some trucks. Put that together and you have the auto industry. So that's relatively straightforward. A little bit more complex way to do this is through business cycle sensitivities. And this is defining businesses and industries as either being cyclical or non-cyclical. One of the issues about this is, when you identify cyclicals, you have to define the cycle. Does the cycle last 3 months? Does it last 3 years? That's always a challenge. Nevertheless, a cyclical company is one whose cash flows and profits and maybe even dividends are strongly correlated with the overall economy. In other words, if the economy is expanding rapidly, then this company or this industry is growing rapidly, whether it's profits or cash flows. And then a non-cyclical company, of course, is one in which there's really no relationship between its performance, its profitability, and the business cycle. And then we can do a final grouping here, and this is according to some statistical similarities. Think about it. Let's suppose that we're considering two industries. I won't name two, but let's just say two industries, and they have very high correlations. Like, just suppose some crazy correlation of 98%. Well, there's no way that you want to invest in both of those industries, because it's like investing double in one or double in the other. But the cool thing about this is when you find industries that have low correlations or even negative correlations, you can use that. Here, let me go back here. You can use that back to identify those active and equity investment opportunities. How about an LOS that asks us to look at industry classification systems? And this is really just a method for you to memorize. These are definitions. There are global industry classification standards. There's the Russell global sectors, and then the industry classification benchmarks. Here are some examples of some classified industries: materials and processing, energy, technology, utilities. And then there are government industry classification systems. And when I was in graduate school, the SIC codes, these were really, really important. Oh, which SIC codes did you use? But let's go back to the LOS here. Compare methods. All right, so government and commercial, that sounds like a good question to me. Compare those two. Moving on to the next LOS, let's take a look at the relationship between the business cycle and growth stocks and defensive stocks and cyclical stocks and industries. So a cyclical firm is one whose earnings and cash flows are highly dependent on the stage of the business cycle. Earnings are highly volatile, right? If the business cycle goes like this, it goes like this, and goes like this, that means that earnings and cash flow, they're going to do the same thing. And that must that must mean that operating leverage is high. Financial services is a good example. Non-cyclical firms on the other hand, produce goods and service for which demand is relatively stable over the business cycle. And I remember being in my first economics class, and the professor was telling us about a non-cyclical firm, and he used the example of a company that produces noodles. We're always going to eat noodles. We always want to have pasta. We always want to have spaghetti, whether we're making lots of money or we're not making any money. Now, the non-cyclicals can be separated into defensive and growth industries. And so the defensive industries, think of a defender, whether it's a cornerback in football or a defender in basketball or in hockey. What are they trying to do? They're trying to defend their goal or their basket or their end zone. And so that word just applies to companies and industries, pretty much like they're not too terribly affected by stages of the business cycle. Growth industries, on the other hand, very different than defense industries. These have demands that are so strong that the stage of the business cycle is not really relevant in evaluating or them being able to produce profits. I can't help but think about this thing that everybody in my family has that I don't have is an iPhone. Every time they come out with a new iPhone, oh my gosh, billions of people buy this thing. But have you noticed in the last couple of months the firm's profitability has declined? So maybe they've hit this price point. They can't keep raising their prices. How about some limitations of using these kinds of terms? And so sometimes firms just leap from one to the other. They can go from being growth to defensive, and it's really difficult to assign a company or an industry a permanent spot in one of those groups. How about a peer group? A list of similar companies, similar business activities, similar demand drivers, similar cost structure drivers, similar capital availability, similar supply chain. And so the cool thing about this is to be able to evaluate a company and then evaluate it against its competition, its peer groups, and say, okay, where do we fit inside of this spectrum? How about if we describe the elements that should be covered in a thorough industry analysis? All right, so let's separate this a couple of different ways. Let's look at different strategic groups because different groups cater to different parts of the market. Let's identify the life cycle. Let's identify the range of forces. And here's where there's a sprinkling of that macroeconomic analysis that I warned you about in that very first slide. The range of forces that may affect the evolution of the industry, including things like interest rates and leverage and oil prices and wars and leadership. There are also these social influences. You know, somebody my age who's 57 years old really can't quite fathom the technology that my children have today and the impact that social media has on their lives. You know, when I was a younger boy, all I wanted to do was play outside with my friends, basketball, football, or wiffle ball. And now all kids want to do is play on their phones and on their computers. Look at that last bullet point, exploring the competitive landscape. This is my colleague calling it an environmental scan. And of course, part of that is to examine the forces that drive the competition. How about this LOS? This is a really good marriage between, you know, the traditional finance, which is pretty much what we talk about all the time in the CFA program, and some management principles. And there's a lot to learn from the academic research over on the management side. This Michael Porter was a Harvard business professor, and he wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review, which has become known as Porter's 5 Forces. And the focus of these 5 forces is really the environmental scan, but particularly looking at who is out there and who is our competition. What do we have to worry about from this group of people? What do we have to worry about from that group of people? In previous videos, I mentioned that I'm reading this book called I Love Capitalism by the founder of Home Depot. And he regularly talks about how he woke up every morning and worried about Lowe's. What is Lowe's doing? What is Lowe's doing? And then on the outside, notice there are bargaining powers of the suppliers and the buyers. And this is what's known in the last, 10 or 15 years in the business world as the supply chain. You know, can the people to whom we sell to, can they get together and form some kind of a log jam? And the people from whom we buy, can they do the same thing? Of course, layered in that discussion is their ability to access the competition. Here's a good LOS on barriers to entry, industry concentration, capacity, and market share stability. Now, let's go back to this one here. Notice I have on the top right there the first focus and the most important part of that Porter's 5 forces, threat of new entrants and the intensity of the rivalry. And so that's what we're looking for here. High barriers to entry reduce competition. I can't help but think that we have this going on today with these large technology companies and these large retail firms doing things like supporting $15 per hour minimum wage and accepting offers from different locales in the United States for building new headquarters. I mean, essentially, that's what this is doing, is to reduce the competition. Now, greater concentration, of course, reduces competition, whereas market fragmentation increases competition. Let me just tell you a quick story. About 20 years ago, when my family and I moved to this particular city, we had a bunch of choices to go buy electronics. We had H.H. Gregg, we had Circuit City, we had another one, I can't think of the name, and we had Best Buy. And today, the only one left is Best Buy. Unused capacity is really important. Think about my days back in high school and college when I worked in the donut factory, and we had a special place in the back of the factory where we had this new piece of equipment. Well, if that equipment was just sitting there unused, then the donut factory owner might think to himself, you know what, maybe if I lowered my price of a donut by, 5 cents or 10 cents or 25 cents, maybe I can then start using that new machinery. So that's good for price competition. And then stable market shares. I mean, if the donut firm always had a 20% market share, that's probably an indication that there's not too much competition. All right, so here's this LOS. Explain these 4 things on pricing power and price competition. All right, how about the industry life cycle? And so all life cycles tend to look like this, where there's a high slope early on. So we're going very growth. That's high growth right in there. And then we kind of flatten out and then we decline. All right, so let's start at the beginning of time, down at the origin. That's 0. But in that embryonic stage, boy, we're probably not selling too much because we really don't know how to do it. It requires significant investment and lots of risk. Think venture capital, think private equity. When we actually do sell a particular unit, it's probably at a relatively higher price, to try to cover all of our costs. So we have slow growth. And it's interesting to note that time period there, that first block of time period, that could be a very short time, like a month, or it might be 6 months. But then what happens? Then the slope of that line increases. So we have rapidly growing profits and we have falling prices. I mean, there's a really, really cool economic phenomenon. We don't have much competition, but then notice as the curve starts to flatten out, as that slope flattens, we have intense competition. And that slows particular growth. It slows our profitability. And then the focus is not so much on the P times Q, not so much on the revenues, but on the cost structure, on the income statement. And then once we hit the mature stage, let's call this the brand name product lines, there's probably very little growth. There might be some mergers and acquisitions, and there's pretty much way significant barriers to entry. And then on the downslope, there's constrictions, there's excess capacity, and there's lots of competition. Now, how about limitations of industry life cycle analysis? And remember how we talked about efficient markets hypothesis in one of these previous readings about technical analysts who try to find patterns in historical prices. Well, the same thing holds true here just a little bit. I mean, it's a little bit of a different angle, but the evolution of an industry does not always follow this predictable pattern. So if the industry is going like this and then this and this and this, it doesn't mean that it's going to continue doing that kind of stuff. And so analysts always have to be careful to ask themselves the question, is history going to repeat itself? Or a better question is, how likely is history going to repeat itself? And if history repeats itself, then I want to be positioned here. And if history doesn't repeat itself, then I'm going to be positioned here. And so this limitation of industry life cycle analysis is really an opportunity to make certain that we're prepared for every eventuality. Let's take a look at an example. Let's take the beverage industry. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, and Nestle. These are major firms. These are major global firms. They sell their product lines all over the world. All right. So what kind of variables should we consider in performing an industry analysis of the beverage industry? How about barriers to entry? Clearly, this is very high. Consumers tend to have very strong brand loyalty. I can't help but give you guys movie examples. Any of you old enough to remember the movie E.T.? There was a big battle in there. What kind of candy E.T. was going to pick up? The Back to the Future movies, there was a controversy over whether Marty McFly was going to drink Coca-Cola or Pepsi. How about industry concentration? Of course, the 2 largest firms in this industry, they dominate the market share. Now, how about influence of industry capacity on pricing? Pricing is pretty much determined by the brand name, not by how many bottles or cans of Coca-Cola that can be produced. The industry is very stable, right? People have been drinking and buying Coca-Cola and by the way, trying to figure out what that formula is for Coca-Cola for many, many years. And this is a market that changes relatively slowly. Although if you go to the web pages for these different companies and click on their product lines, you'll see they make all kinds of stuff. But those other drinks, whether it's milk or juice, those other drinks, tend to contribute a very small amount to their profitability and cash flows. There's intense competition between the top couple of firms, but brand awareness really determines this. Demographic influences, I'm not sure how applicable this is, but clearly young people have preferences, and less than young people might have their preferences as well. My father's 83 years old, and he loves a particular brand of ginger ale. Government influence, the industry is largely unregulated, but I will give you an example of political risk here in our local markets. Some politicians decided that it was really important to tax the consumption of these sugary drinks. And what has happened is inside of this relatively small geographic area, the sales of these particular sugary drinks has plummeted. And it has benefited those food stores that are located right outside the boundaries. So in general, from a federal standpoint, the government influence is low, but on a regional or a local level, it can be significant. Social influences, I'm not sure how applicable this is, but there might be some social instances that occur because some popular social media person decides to drink one of these over another. You're never quite sure how that pans out. And then technology. You figured out that these companies, they pretty much know how to make their product, and they've done it as many different ways as possible. They come up with 0 calories and 0 sugars and 0, 0, 0. Pretty soon you're going to drink it and there's going to be nothing there. But so they've probably exhausted at least the limits of technology as we know them today. But tomorrow, who knows? Here's the good LOS from linking the macroeconomic stuff all the way down to what we're mainly talking about, the industry variables here. All right, so what is going to determine industry growth and profitability and risk? Things like interest rates and inflation, of course. Things like availability of credit. Things like economic growth. Things like oil prices. Things like anything that we talked about back in that macroeconomic reading is going to have an impact on our specific company and industry profitability. How about some examples of other influences, technological influences, blockchain? Remember in our previous reading, we talked about distributed ledger technology, where you have either publicly or privately this file, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet or some kind of an algorithm, and anybody who's either invited or anybody who wants to can get in there and make changes, and then those changes have to be accepted by a consensus of the users. Wow, that's an amazing advancement in technology. Aging populations and millennials, of course that's important. I know nothing about millennials. Government influence, of course, taxing and healthcare legislation. Here in the United States, we go back to the late 1940s when health insurance was coupled with employment, and hasn't gone very smoothly ever since then. And then social influences, marijuana, alcohol, cigarettes, vaping, that seems to be a big thing today. And then how about elements of a thorough company analysis? So think about what we've done. We've analyzed the entire economy, the macroeconomy. Then we have found, those good industries in there. So maybe we have 4 or 5 or 10 industries that we like. Then we want to find those best stocks inside of those high growth industries. So how do we do that at the company level? We start at the top, we're working all of our way down to the bottom. How do we do that? Well, we analyze the products and services. These are the brand name product lines of all these companies. It's essential to look at the historical context of the product lines. Has it been successful? When was it successful? And why was it successful in the past? We need to examine relevant industry characteristics like life cycles and business cycles, and brand loyalty, entry and exit barriers. It's always important to look at the supply and demand. This is the supply chain that I was talking about before, looking about where we're getting all of our inputs and where are all of our outputs going, and how can we increase the demand for the product line, and how can we differentiate our product line. And then an examination of the pricing environment is important. That's why it's so critical to understand things like elasticity of demand, so that companies know that if they raise their prices by 3%, then total revenue might grow by 1% or it might grow by 5%. And then, of course, you can't do a thorough company analysis without trying to put together some kind of mathematics. And so one way to do this is through some ratio analysis, which we've talked about in other readings, but also through some other stuff that we're going to do in future readings, like compute the intrinsic value of a share of stock using dividends or free cash flows. And that takes us through this important reading. We'll finish up equity investments with valuation. So make sure you bring your calculators next time.